Well, good afternoon, and thank you to those who have joined us for this webinar. And what we're going to talk about today is essentially what is it that is keeping parents out of the formal childcare system. And I want to just go through and talk a little bit about BPC. For those of you, by the way, who don't know me, my name is Linda Smith, and I am the director of the Early Childhood Initiative here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. We are a Washington, D.C. based think tank that tries to take the best ideas from both sides of the aisle to propose solutions to America's most pressing problems. And obviously, childcare is one of those pressing problems for many American families. So I want to remind people that you can pose questions as we get into this briefing, and they're both through the live chat on the YouTube site or through the Twitter using the hashtag BPC Live. So with that in mind, I want to let's go to the first slide. I want to talk a little bit about where we, keep going to the next slide, please. Okay, this is just a little bit of background on why we did this particular survey. As many of you know, we have been looking at the potential need for childcare as a, against the capacity we have in childcare. We have done that work in 35 states and are continuing to do it in more states as the time goes on. What we have found is that we have approximately 1/3 of America's children who potentially need childcare because all of their available parents are in the workforce and they don't have access to it. In other words, there's no childcare within a certain reasonable distance of where they live. And that gap, as you can see, is higher in rural parts of our country. So what we have been trying to figure out here at BPC is where are these children? Where are the 1/3 of America's children who are nowhere that we know of? So what we are asking with this particular survey is where are they? And why are they not in the formal childcare system? And I think we found some very interesting things and some things that surprised us. And I think some things that will help inform where we go next with childcare. Because if these children need care and can't have it, then the question is, how do we develop a system that can meet their needs? So if we go on to the next slide, please. I'm going to introduce one of my best friends in the world lately, Claire Taylor, who is the Director of Client Services at Morning Consult. And we've been doing these surveys now for almost 3 years, Claire. And Claire has become one of the experts in the nation on sort of what's going on in childcare. And so she's going to go through what we found out, what we found with this particular survey. And then after that, we're going to hear from a couple of parents. We just called a couple of parents and asked them to, talk to us about their decisions. And it was very affirming to what we found in the survey. So I'm going to turn it over to Claire now. And Claire, if you will walk us through the results of the survey, and then we'll have a conversation at the end. Again, reminding people to, if you have questions, to put them in the chat. So Claire, you're on.
Awesome. Thank you, Linda. And before we dive into the results, to give some background to this survey that we most recently conducted together, Understanding the 1/3. So in addition to understanding why parents are choosing informal care, we wanted to understand what barriers and interests they have in using formal childcare. So we surveyed 1,000 parents of children ages 0 through 5, with all available members in the household currently employed who were currently using informal childcare. And the survey was in May, so recently conducted. And before we dive in, we'll be using these terms formal and informal. So just to define that upfront, of formal childcare referring to a childcare center, a family childcare home, pre-K or Head Start program, while informal refers to a child receiving care from their relatives, parents, friends, or a nanny. And like Linda said, we have been working together for almost 3 years now, and this has been a question that has arose on every survey we have done is, okay, there's such a large percent of parents using informal care or who prefer informal care. Why and how and what are they doing and how are they doing that while they're working? Would they want to use formal care? So this is really the culmination of many studies where we're finally getting to dive into that. And throughout, you'll see that we did ask a lot of open-end questions to try to get at that why. So that's included throughout this analysis, trying to hear from the voice of the parent more directly, even in a survey. So what did we learn? Consistent with other surveys we have done, safety and trust are top factors as parents using informal care think about their child care arrangement, which could be driving for why they like informal care. We see this double-edged sword of trust of these parents are highly likely to trust themselves or a relative to provide care for their child, and some distrust towards sending their child to a child care center. We also found that parents using informal care arrangements need care in untraditional work hours. We found that about a quarter need care during the weekends or outside of traditional work hours. And there's some unpredictability in their work arrangement, so trying to accommodate what their work schedule is with what their childcare needs are. And next we found, I think this is really interesting, that parents are satisfied with their informal childcare arrangement that they're using. A high percent, 90% plus, are satisfied with their current arrangement, and about 62% find formal childcare arrangements as unappealing to them, rather than about a third say that they are inaccessible. But I think as we go through, just because they are satisfied with their arrangement doesn't mean that they are not interested in a formal arrangement. And next here we see that cost is frequently referenced as a top of mind consideration as these parents who are currently using informal care consider a formal childcare arrangement. That's a top of mind factor, as well as COVID-19 influencing as parents think about the safety as their child, as well as their work arrangement and how that can change based on their childcare needs or preferences. So those are just some of the top findings we're going to dive through a little more deeper here. So first, starting with reasons for informal care. So overall, we see that of the parents surveyed, 68% are currently using parent-provided care. So they are either providing care for their child themselves, rotating with their partner or spouse, or their partner or spouse is providing care. Additionally, a quarter are relying on relatives for this care. And you can see about 80% of those relatives are grandparents. And here we asked, when choosing your childcare arrangement for your youngest child, what factors were top of mind? So really wanted to hear from parents what they're thinking about. And the main buckets we see, I think there's some ones we expect and then some ones that were unique to this survey and audience. We see safety, cost, trust, and work, and those factors people are thinking about as they send their child to childcare. But as ones that I think were really unique were quality of care and time. So parents wanting to spend time at home with their child as they grow up, wanting a family member or someone that they know and trust to provide care. And additionally, there were some parents who listed a top factor as just not wanting a formal childcare arrangement. They would rather opt for a family member or to personally provide care. And here, a similar question, we asked how important or unimportant each of these factors were. So from flexibility, cost, location, learning and development, as well as safety and trust. And across these are the different types of arrangements parents are currently using. And we see safety and trust are top and highly important to parents across the board of the different arrangements that they are using. And so I think that's just important to keep in mind. I think we learned more about what safety and trust means to these parents, and that is different than parents in formal childcare arrangements, but that is those are top of mind to parents, regardless of what type of arrangement they're using. In this slide too, I think with safety and trust is the safety and trust that's often goes along with family members. And so this question, Linda and I were, I think, really surprised by the results of asking parents who had, if they had personally changed or their family members had moved or changed their work arrangement in order to provide care for their child. And those brackets are the net percentages that you're seeing there. So we see overall 40% of parents have made one of these changes in order for their family members to provide care. And that percentage is higher among urban adults than the parents of other community types, as well as parents who are in a salaried job rather than an hourly job. But that's a very high percentage of parents making lifestyle changes in order to have a parent or relative provide this care.
You know, and Claire, if I could jump in here too, because I think we had to be persuaded to put this particular question in. Mm-hmm. And it was very surprising in terms of just the percentages of people making major life changes to accommodate childcare. And I think that warrants, as far as we are concerned, you know, more investigation as we move forward in terms of exactly why some of that is occurring. But it was startling. We were convinced to put the question in, we put the question in, and then very surprised at the answer.
Mm-hmm. And I think you're right, it warrants of, was this a necessity or was it a preference for the parents to do this and to make these changes so someone they know could provide the care?
And when we hear from parents, the two parents that we interviewed following this, you're going to hear this come out as well. Mm.
Great, a good little preview. So to keep going here, so some circumstances for informal care. So trying to understand more about what parents are currently doing and their need for childcare. So to start, we wanted to understand a little bit more about their work arrangement. So asking, how far in advance are you aware of your work schedule? And we see overall, a quarter of parents, 28%, are aware of their work schedule 2 weeks in advance or less, while nearly half have a fixed work schedule and 16% make their own work schedule. And what this graph is awareness of work schedule by different occupations or job classifications. So service worker, trade skill worker, admin, healthcare, or other professionals.
And can I jump in here too? I don't mean to keep interrupting you, but you know, this has been consistent over time as well. We've been asking this. Can you comment on that? Because we've asked this question now several times and we're seeing a pattern here, are we not?
Yes, what's the pattern is that nearly half of the service retail labor workers are aware of their work schedule 2 weeks in advance or less, right? That is very high and I think really important for many of us who work in DC and come to work, you know, every day to the same office to remember that that's not the case for many parents, and specifically, you know, a quarter overall, I think is still a very high percentage. And then 45 specifically working in that type of job occupation.
But that's a high percentage of parents then who really can't access the formal system because of the limited hours. I think that's where we have got to pay attention.
And that's what we, you know, I think is important is if you're not aware of your work schedule, how can you be aware of your childcare schedule to help set up with what you need? And here again, this slide, I think just to sort of show it in a different lens of what parents are doing, the changes they're making. Like I said, overall, 40% of parents have personally or have had family members move or change their work arrangement in order to provide care. And that number is even higher, 48% among parents who are currently using relatives for care have made one of these changes to have their parents provide care. And next, these questions, I think, is a really interesting finding too, that we added in last minute, of trying to understand the influence of having more than one child under the ages of 0 to 5. Linda had heard that in her conversations of how significant this is, and it's very significant. 80% of parents who have children, more than one child, ages 0 through 5, say that this influences their child care arrangement. And we asked why does this influence your situation? And 40%, when we analyzed the open ends, specifically reference cost or money as to why it influences their arrangement. And just to read some of the things that parents said is the cost of care for 2 kids is literally more than I make. So anytime there's a conflict where we can't arrange care via family, I have to cut work. That it gets more complicated and difficult to find places where a child care provider could take both of their children. So then the idea of dropping one child off at one place and the other at the other is just difficult and expensive. So it did really influence their decision in child care. So next here, looking at flexibility of informal child care, first thinking about cost and then work arrangement. So among parents who are using a relative, friend, neighbor, or nanny for childcare currently, 55%, a majority, are not paying for this care. And this is even higher among those who are currently using a relative. 67% are not paying for care. And among those who are, on average, they're paying $220 a week. So I think as we think about cost and how that is such a barrier and top of mind to parents, it's because this is not a part of their budget right now for many of them. So to think about how much it would cost to send their child to a formal childcare arrangement is a significant barrier, because for many it's not in their budget as a family at all right now. And next here is, when do parents need care? So we asked, when do you need childcare during a typical week? And we found that 64% need care during traditional hours, 26% during the weekends, and 23% during non-traditional hours, which is a lot of parents who need care outside of the typical 8 to 5 workday, which is when the majority of childcare providers are really strictly operating in. But when we asked, okay, when do you need hours in those non-traditional hours, it's really right on both ends of the workday. So either 81% need care 6 to 8 p.m. That's outside of traditional work hours, and 48% need it right before the workday begins, between 6 a.m. and 8 a.m. So a lot of needs could be met with this slight extension of childcare providers providing care during that time. And moving on here to interest in formal care. Here we ask, how satisfied or unsatisfied are you with your current child care arrangement? And we see overall 90% plus are satisfied with their formal child care arrangement. And this is particularly high among those who are currently using relatives for care, 96%, or a friend, neighbor, or nanny, 96% as well. However, just because you are satisfied with your care arrangement doesn't mean that you're not interested in a formal child care arrangement, which we see here on this next question. We asked, if childcare were free and in a convenient location for your family, what type of childcare arrangement would you prefer for your youngest child? And this is a question we have asked many times before and has always stumped us, because it really prompted this research of, what do parents prefer? How are they thinking about this? Because we see that 57% still prefer an informal childcare arrangement. Even if it was free and in a convenient location, that is what they would prefer. However, we do see that 42% would prefer a formal childcare arrangement, most likely being a childcare center or a pre-K program.
Claire, can I ask you a question here? Did you see any patterns or correlation with parents when it came to the trust issue and this high number in terms of the preference, despite, if it were available and free?
Yeah, actually, because we asked a follow-up question as to why, like, why is this your preferred arrangement? And specifically for informal care, we see that trust really carry through. That is why they prefer informal care, as I trust my family and I don't trust formal institutions, and there's more control over the quality of care their child is receiving. Where for people who prefer formal care, we don't see trust in that word mentioned, right? It's more here we see the learning and development, the convenience, the preparation and skills that it would teach children, and having formal training of caretakers provide that care. Which I think is interesting. Trust, when people think, when parents using informal care think about using formal care, trust is not what that driving factor is in that preference. It's more some of these other social teachings and social development.
Would be interesting to know if there's any, and we don't have any way of knowing this, but maybe some in the audience do, the correlation with the quality of care in what's available too. But we don't know the answer to that. I didn't mean to stump you on that.
Yeah, no problem. No problem. And I think just to stay here for a minute to read some of these quotes for why people prefer a formal childcare. They do a lot to help develop and teach them and provide kids how to learn and interact with others. It's a place children can play with other kids and have structured development. And for why people prefer informal care, we love being able to spend time with our kids. They trust family members, have no doubt that their child's cares and needs will be fulfilled. And simply because no one can take better care of my child than me, which I think is an interesting way to put that, very succinct. And next here too, trying to understand if parents had ever used formal childcare before. Was this something that they entered and left? And we do see a third, 38%, had used formal childcare before. That percent is highest among higher income adults and parents in the West Coast, more likely than parents in other regions. And we asked, why did you stop using formal childcare? And in addition to cost, we also see the implications of the pandemic, right? COVID-19, they stopped using their current provider, they closed. Their work arrangement changed with the pandemic. They were able to have a more flexible work arrangement, work from home. They saw that that was an opportunity that they could figure out. Or they had a bad experience in formal care setting where they just weren't receiving the care that they or their child needed. So last sections here on barriers to formal childcare. Wanting to understand the availability of these type of childcare centers in their community. So we see that about half of parents say that access to these different formal childcare centers are limited in their community. And that's particularly high among rural parents. 66% of rural parents saying access to a child care center is limited in their community. So I think to keep in mind is accessibility and just ease of access to these different types of child care providers. Additionally here, we were really interested in this question to pin against, is formal childcare unappealing or is it inaccessible, and trying to understand and dig through that. And we see 62% of parents say formal childcare is unappealing to me. And they reference cost, lack of trust, concern of safety and quality of care of why formal childcare is unappealing. While 38% say it's inaccessible, which is I think about, how formal childcare can evolve and change. It seems like those are the people who would really consider it if maybe it was more affordable, it was easier to access, it was closer to home, and there were shorter wait lists. Those were reasons why people listed, when we asked why, they said it was inaccessible. And I think too here to look at the different demographic differences. First at income, the lower income level, the more likely they are to say that it's inaccessible. Additionally, across race and ethnicity, we see that non-white parents are more likely than white parents to say formal arrangements are inaccessible to them. And last slide here, I think about, as we think about solutions and different ways for formal childcare to become more accessible to people, we see that parents are most likely to consider sending their child to a formal childcare arrangement if it was located inside their work or their spouse's workplace, or it was affordable or within their budget. About half saying that they would be likely to consider sending their child if those two factors were true. Which I think is a consistent trend we've seen throughout this data is accessibility and cost. And so I think to summarize this here, I think that was the last slide is cost is a top of mind factor, but there are definitely other considerations such as availability, accessibility, and when those providers are open and providing care to think about, as we think about these 1/3 parents who are currently using informal, and that they've made changes to use informal care, whether that was their family was making changes or they made changes to their work arrangement as a family unit to use this type of care, which they preferred because they consider themselves trustworthy and safe. So that sort of summarizes our findings from what we learned from this survey.
I'm curious as to, I think there's a myth out there, to be honest with you, of people who say that, low-income parents are paying 1/3 or 40% or half of their income for childcare. I think what we're figuring out here is they're not paying for childcare. They just simply can't afford it. And I wondered if you saw anything in terms of those even paying relatives. If in this, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but is there anything that we can conclude from those paying for informal care by sort of income level or any other of the demographic factors?
Yeah, I think we would have to go back and look at that question among people who were paying, what that looked like by income level. But I think it's something definitely to keep in mind, right? I think it was 2/3 of people who were using relatives were not paying for childcare that they were currently using from their relatives. They were using, it wasn't for parent provided care. They were using someone else to provide care for their child, and they're not paying. And so I think there is a family cohesion. There is an arrangement that has been made for these families to continue working and for their child to have care for their family to be able to keep working.
And I think the final thing that I'd like for you to comment on, because this is really a pet peeve of mine, as you know, yes. I think we mix up family and friend and neighbor care. And that we lump them all into one type of care in this country. And I think they're very different. I think the data is starting to show that. And they're really, it is mostly relative care, as you keep saying, as opposed to the friends and neighbors. Am I wrong?
You are right. It was 25% were using relatives and 4% friend or neighbor, 3% nanny, right? So those are very small numbers, and relatives is really where people are going to if it's not themselves. That's the place that they're going for care.
And that's been consistent. Am I right on that? I mean, we've seen this in other surveys, and I do think it's important for our community to start distinguishing between these, because how you approach the family, the relatives ish, as a provider of care versus these other populations, I think they're two different things. So anyway, yes. I just put that, make a note of that. We're going to go now and hear from two parents that we talked to actually on Friday to see what, why they had made the choices they had made. And I think you'll see that unprompted, these parents said pretty much what your survey said. So let's, if we can go to the first parent now.
Sure. My name is Nathan Faber, and I live on the White Earth Reservation in Minnesota, and I work for the White Earth Tribal Police Department. I am their IT person, and I also run surveillance. My son is Nathan Jr. and my daughter is Natalie. They are 12 and 14. And some great kids. I was not living near home when I first had childcare. I was living in Mille Lacs, which is about 3.5 hours away from home. And I did actually have childcare at first, normal childcare, but I was paying more for childcare than I was for my mortgage or my rent at the time, I should say. And along with some of my other payments all together. And I was still paying more for childcare than I was everything else. So I just simply couldn't afford it anymore. And if I wanted to continue to provide for my children, I had to make that choice.
Okay.
Because of that, I actually had to move back home because I couldn't afford it. And there was nobody that I trusted down there, nobody that I could say, hey, will you watch my kids for X amount of time and we can set up a pay. There was nobody that I could actually trust to do that. So I actually had to quit my job and move back home. And yeah, because I just simply could not afford to live. And the daycare cost was, I was paying $1,500 a month for daycare.
Wow.
Yeah, so I just simply couldn't afford it no more. And I moved back home. Then I got a job at home, and I did informal because cost again. And I had family this way, so I was able to set up payments with family members and pay them rather than, and that basically raised me. So I had a lot of trust in them.
So when you say family members, can you be more specific?
My grandmother on my mom's side, and then my sister-in-law. Well, for me personally, the transition from Mille Lacs back to home, and that was like a shocker for my children. And not going to their daycare anymore, which the daycare that I had them in was amazing. I have no complaints about the daycare. They were learning so much. It was just the cost. I felt really horrible taking them out of that daycare. But grandma had them and they were able to learn from grandma. I eventually was able to get onto a childcare program, and I had a co-payment of $250 a month. And
pretend that you have the mic and you could speak to policymakers in Washington, D.C. What do you want them to know about childcare from you as a parent?
That there shouldn't be such a cost for looking after our future. I don't believe that you should have to pay somebody that amount. To pay them, yes, but not that amount to the point where, for me, I had to move back home. I was comfortable in my house where I was, and because I couldn't afford to live there, I had to uproot my whole family to rely on other family members. And that really, I had my head down low because of that. So, and I felt like I was not a good parent because of that. So it was really a struggle for me. So yeah, cost is just, it was either take them out of daycare or not feed them, not have a roof over their heads. So it was a very tough decision to make.
My name is Jessica Jordan. I am a pediatric nurse in Oregon. I live in Portland, and I work at Dornbucker Children's Hospital, which is affiliated with Oregon Health and Sciences University. I work 12-hour shifts as a floor staff nurse and also a charge nurse. So my shifts are 7 a.m. to 7:30 p.m. And then I've most recently taken on a new role of the nursing staff cardiac educator for several units in my hospital. I have 3 kiddos. Tyler is 14, Gavin just turned 12, and my daughter Hadley is 8. So I first went back to work at 12 weeks postpartum with Tyler. So he was pretty young, and I was working 3 12-hour shifts a week at that time. And so I really wanted Tyler to have some consistency on the days that I wasn't there. We really thought about cost at the time. I was fairly new out of nursing school, so had a lot of student debt, and the cost of infant childcare was almost as much as what my salary would have been, really. So we were lucky enough to have grandparents that not only were local, but near retirement. And then I also was lucky enough that at the time my husband had a job that could be a little bit flexible. So we were able to just kind of piecemeal family. So I think at the very beginning, I would say finances, and then just a sense of, this is my first baby, and I was intimidated to send him outside of the home, since I did have the option of keeping him with grandparents or my husband. It's very challenging with the formal daycare setting or childcare setting of if your child is sick, because if they show up and they have a little runny nose or low-grade fever, then you're called to come pick up your child. Whereas I can say, here, grandma, sorry, they have the sniffles, and I can still go to work. So that piece was definitely a factor with my job when we first were deciding. I think the biggest surprise for me was the time constraints. So working my shift of being at work at 7 a.m., I may leave home about 6:20, 6:30. And then even when I'm supposed to get off at 7:30, oftentimes I don't leave there till 8 if we have a patient emergency. You know, it's not cut and dry. And all of the childcare centers that I even considered, you pretty much couldn't drop off until 7-ish. And then pickup was firm at 6 p.m. I think there were 2 places that we looked into that were open at least until 8. But then if you were past 8 o'clock, it was crazy overcharges. And just at baseline, those places required a minimum commitment of 4 or 5 days a week. And with my shifts falling a lot on the weekends, we didn't need that. So my parents did end up building a house very close to us. It's actually walkable. And I am pretty sure that they wouldn't have made that exact choice without our situation being what it was. And actually my husband's parents just built a house near us as well, a couple miles away, and it's been incredibly helpful.
If you were standing in front of a politician or a policymaker and you had one thing you'd like them to hear about the childcare situation for either you, your family, or your colleagues, what would it be?
Maternity leave, FMLA is my number one, because women should not be needing childcare at age 12 weeks with this small little infant. As a woman who has had 3 babies, and I work in healthcare, I work at a hospital, and I still had to pay for all of my own short-term disability and cover the rest of my time with just vacation time. Number 2, I think having a flexible, almost like a flexible spending for childcare, which would have it be a little bit more flexible about where you can use it, because we actually were never allowed to use that to say reimburse, a nanny shares. The way that it's structured, I think it's a great idea, but it doesn't play out practically for a lot of people.
Okay. Well, I think we can tell from both of these interviews with parents that they said, Claire, just everything that you found in the survey. I was taking notes, going hours, trust, moving, think about it. I think it affirms what we found in the survey, but it also makes us really have to, I think, be more serious about this kind of care in this country.
Yeah, I think hearing from both of them about the parents was really interesting, that they both made changes to be close to relatives, or their parents made changes to be close to their children, right? That was both really interesting.
Well, and I think it's pretty sad when you think about the father feeling guilty because he can't afford, $1,500 a month for childcare, when, most of our parents are at the low end of their wage. So I think that's really sad, and what we're doing to families and making them feel guilty on that. We have a question that just came in, and this is interested. Given that many people prefer informal care, what does that mean for the childcare gap and the increasing supply of childcare? And I think that's a really good question. I don't think it's one that we have all of the answers to. right now. Claire, we've talked about this in the past in terms of if, you know, and we're getting closer, I think, to understanding it. But one of the things that I think we need to still know is exactly this question about this, you know, how much is cost now the factor over just the pure preference for care? And I think we still have some work to do on that one. What would you say on that?
Yeah, there were two places where we asked, I think, if care was free and convenient, what would you choose? We see this 2/5, 3/5 split of 2/5 would still prefer informal, and we see about 3/5 interested, or I have that reversed. 3/5 would say informal, 2/5 would say formal. So about 40%, and additionally, informal arrangements are inaccessible. That was the same split. 40% said that it was inaccessible compared to 60% who said it was unappealing. So I think that's where we sort of see that fallout continuously of like, of this 1/3, I think we see about 40% who would consider formal childcare.
Mm-hmm. I think what it does, if we go back to the gap work that we're doing, I think what it does is if we can get closer on the actual gap. In other words, there's going to be a certain percentage of parents that are going to always want that care. I think that number is a little soft still in what we know, but it does mean that the gap is less than what we're finding just based on numbers of children and distance to care if it's there. So I think that's one thing. This is really an interesting question. Was there any data collected on the age of the providers of informal care? And we didn't ask that question, did we?
No, we did not ask, but we know that 80% are grandparents. So I think that's an interesting question.
Yeah, that is a very interesting question. Here's another question. What role can and does culture play in how 1/3 of these families choose informal care? I think that's a very interesting question, and one we have talked about that. And if you can remember, I don't know that we had enough data to draw any real conclusions on that. Did we, based on any of the race and ethnicity issues?
Yeah, that's correct. That's a similar question that we asked as we were looking through the data was, what does this look like across race and ethnicity? And we had such a large percent of our sample who were using parent-provided care that reduced the amount that we had to look at who were using relatives. So we weren't able to look at the data that way, but I think it's something we're thinking about as we move forward to ensure that we can look into that.
Mm-hmm. Here's another really good question, and I wish we had more answers for it. What can the government and the formal childcare system do to support relative providers and other informal care providers? And I think that is a really good question for the audience, actually. And I would say to the audience, I think we need to think about that. We need and we get asked that question by people on the Hill. There is an interest, and I think no one wants to replace relatives or grandma. You know, I mean, I think we're all there, but how do we support them? I think that is a good question for the early childhood community. And I don't know that we really have an answer to that at this point. I think there are some tax provisions that could possibly play in here. But that is, as I said, a good question. Here's another good one. Did you include after school care as a part of this child care? And we did not. And Claire, you can explain that.
Yeah, since we were specifically surveying parents with children 0 through 5, we were really focusing on that type of child care.
And that is always a question that we have when we do these surveys. Is it birth to 5? Is it birth to 12? You know, and we go back and forth in terms of that issue. I think as we dig into the school age issue, and this has come up in recent meetings that we had with state administrators here last week. It's come up in a number of conversations. I think we're going to need to take a look at the school age issue separate from the birth to 5 issue, because I think they are very different when it comes to especially the relative care thing. Here's another question. These are all really great questions, by the way. How can formal childcare options better meet the needs of working families? Well, do you want to take that one, Claire? I think we have some answers on that, right?
Will you say that question again? I missed the beginning of it.
It says, how can formal childcare options better meet the needs of working families? Well, I
Stay
can
open
say one
until
right
8
off the top of my
p.m.
head. The hours of care.
Yep.
And
Yep.
I think that's where we're going to have to pay attention to, is the formal system meeting the needs of a lot of these families for this 6 to 8 in the morning and 6 to 8 in the evening? And that's what the survey found. And that was pretty strong. And that wasn't the first time, correct?
It wasn't the first time. On this one, it was 81% needed care from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. And that is consistent on these surveys. It's right at those two ends of the normal workday. So this formal childcare arrangement, think about extending, and just as that mom was saying, right, she has a 12-hour shift and the childcare provider wasn't open during that time.
Mm-hmm. And I think the other thing I usually like to point out when it comes to this issue too is we've done some survey work, and we're about to go into the field with a survey of businesses. And I think this is one of the areas where business can help us out, because how are they scheduling families, and especially families with young children who need care? And I think this is kind of one of these places where there's shared responsibility between business and the childcare system. When it comes to childcare, we can't expect childcare programs to stay open for more hours without it costing them. And I think that's the other thing, because there's a real cost of care when you go 6 to 8 in the evening. It's harder to find staff. There's a whole bunch of issues going on. And we need to recognize that and be prepared to pay for it. And I don't mean parents pay for it. I mean, somehow the system is going to have to figure out how to pay for it. So, okay, the next question, how does cost and access affect family choice? Does either seem to play a larger role in the decisions to use informal care? What would you say about that, cost or access? Can we tease that out?
You know, I think cost is top of mind. I think as parents think about formal childcare, that is the one that is quick to reference because there's a monetary, amount to it. They think they cannot pay or afford a different amount. That said, I think the access issue is right there. I don't think it ends with cost. I think there is a variety of things that go into that decision, and the limited availability, definitely plays a part. We saw that, right? That over half said that there was limited options of any formal childcare arrangement in their community. So I think those are both factors, but we did see cost more likely to be referenced first.
Mm-hmm. I think that's true. Here's a question, and these are all great questions. I thank the audience for participating in this. Do you have an estimate of how many families would use formal childcare if it was affordable and accessible? I think we do have that. That's in the numbers, yes. Claire. Yeah.
Yes, it's about, let me just go find that slide. I think it's about 60% who said it was a formal childcare arrangement that they said that they preferred the most, while about a third, yes, 57% prefer informal and 42% preferred formal if it was free and convenient.
So that's a pretty significant, of the third of parents in this country who don't have access, that's a pretty significant number. If you were to apply that to, let's say, 3 million, I mean, that's a pretty big number who don't have that. Here's a really interesting question. Given the need for flexible options and supporting parent choices, do you think any version of an enhanced tax credit, Family Security Act 2.0 or others, can pass on a bipartisan basis? And I think that, yes, a part of the solution to the childcare issue is in some kind of tax policy. And we've said that at BPC forever, in that the best way to approach this is a mix of direct support for families and direct support for childcare and tax policy for some people. And I think that we've got to figure that out. I think there's interest on the Hill. We've seen legislation on both sides of the aisle on this issue. I think people are on the Hill are trying to figure out what are some tax policies that would work that could help this. So I think on that one, definitely yes. Here's another one. How does the need for childcare during non-traditional hours affect a family's decision to use formal care? What options do parents have for formal care during these times? Well, they don't have very many options. I think that's the problem. We do have some family childcare in some states, that in some places where the states have tried to develop non-traditional hours care. There's some states close. I think Pennsylvania's done some work on this. We need to look at this, and we need to do more work, I think, on figuring out how to answer that question, non-traditional hours. I think the one thing that we've learned, and Claire, correct me if I'm wrong on this, is that non-traditional is not 24-hour. It's really those 2 hours before and after the current, the typical workday that are the problem for most families. And I think if we stop thinking of it as almost an insurmountable problem of 24-hour, all day, overnight, etc., we might be able to tackle the problem. So I think there are solutions out there. And again, to the audience, we need your help. We need your thoughts and what are some solutions? So Claire, it looks like that's the last of the questions that I have. I guess I want to, in summarizing this work, you've been doing this now, as we said, for 3 years. What has surprised you most in all of the work, and what are the big takeaways for you?
Yeah, I think what has surprised me is the consistency of factors, right? Like I think going back to one of those first slides of what factors are top of mind as you think about childcare, safety and trust and quality of care set in a variety of ways, and that means different things for different parents, but those are the factors that they're thinking about the most and really trying to make the right decision for themselves and for their family and for their child. I think what has surprised me specifically in this one is the consistent preference for informal care, that it's not, that regardless of if it's free and convenient, that there's still going to be many parents who think that that's the right place to go. Thinking a little larger, I think the pieces of work, the awareness of work schedule, that's always I can't let it go. The 48% of service or retail workers who are aware of their work schedule 2 weeks in advance or less, and remembering the mental math that these parents have to do every week to make sure that their parents are picking up the kids at the right time, because maybe their shift starts at noon instead of 2, that if that is something that employers can consider thinking about, I think would be really impactful, as those, if that one variable is consistent, how that could help other variables like childcare remain the same as well.
Mm-hmm. You know, I think that in listening to the parents that we had, I also am kind of taken or struck by the fact that this impacts literally just about everyone, you know. And I think about Jessica and the nurse. I mean, whole healthcare profession does not work an 8 to 5 shift. And, you know, so you look around at what part of the United States works 8 to 5 anymore, and it's really not very many. And so I think as we start to think forward with childcare, we're going to have to start to think about how do we get more flexibility in the childcare it's in the formal system so that we can accommodate some of these changes. And we all know they're changing. If you look at the remote work now, and what are the implications on childcare for remote work? We've got a lot of challenges in front of us, and I think we've got some serious thinking to do in designing a system that works for all parents. And I think that's one of the things that we've been trying to do at BPC, as I said, thinking about Jessica also said in her, she closed with the paid family leave. We need to figure out what is a good paid family leave policy, paid parental leave in this country. How does that factor in? What do we do with relatives? What role do taxes play in all of this? How many and how much do we need to spend directly on subsidizing the care of families so that people like Nathan don't have to feel like they're failing as parents because they can't pay the outrageous costs? So we got a lot of work to do, and I think we're learning more and more, and especially Claire, with the help that Morning Consult has been, the great partnership that we've had with you over the last 3 years. So if people in the audience, in closing out, have thoughts on this, please send them to us. We are open. We are continuing to do this work and try and figure this out. So with that in mind, I want to thank Claire and everyone at Morning Consult and the staff here at BPC, and continue the dialogue here and see what we can do moving forward to meet the needs of America's working families. So thank you, everyone. Go to our website. You'll find the slides, the top lines, all of it's available on the Bipartisan Policy Center's Early Childhood Initiative website. So again, thank you, Claire, very much.
Yes, thanks, Linda. More to come.
Yeah.